Today is April 7th, 1975, and I'm speaking to Rabbi Haselkorn, Abraham Haselkorn, in Sahala, Israel.
Alex, I arrived in Le Mans toward the end of August 1944. And I believe the day or the following day after I arrived, a Mr. Trachtenberg appeared in my office.
How would you spell Trachtenberg?
Trachtenberg, and began to tell me that there were numbers of Jewish children hidden among the farmers in the area around Le Mans. And he wanted help. He had already collected about 10 or 12 of them. And of course I immediately offered my services.
Now how did he get to you?
I believe he had heard from Chaplain Haselkorn, who had passed through a week before, that there would probably be another chaplain appearing with the movement of the troops into the area. Chaplain Haselkorn had been with, I think, 20th Army Corps, which is on the move, while my outfit, the Loire Base Section, as it was called, was functioned as a supply, immediate supply to the men in the front lines. And I immediately plunged into the work of contributing to this task of what could we do for these children. He had about 10 or 12 in a house with a Gentile woman with whom he lived at the time. And within a week, we had collected another 8 or 10, simply going around to French farmers. Now, how did we get these children? There are 3 ways. In some cases, they demanded payment, and we gave them money.
From what funds?
Out of my pocket.
We ever?
I had no. I was never reimbursed because I'll come to that
okay,
later.
Yes. Okay.
In some cases, they gave the children voluntarily. In some cases, they said they will not give us the child unless they get permission from the church in Paris. And then the story began to unfold that these children had been placed throughout this area by Père Devaux, D-E-V-E-A-U-X, I believe, one of the priests in the Notre Dame de Sion church in Paris. Parenthetically, the church was founded by a Jewish convert to Catholicism. And so some of these farmers said that they would not give us the child unless they received orders from the church which had brought the children. Now, by that time, I say we had within this house somewhere between 16 and 20 children. And in a private house, this was becoming unbearable, difficult. And of course, these children had been hidden ostensibly as Christians. They wore Catholic medallions and so on and so forth. And then my clerk and my cantor and Irving Rosenbusch, who had begun to work with me, as well as others, GIs.
Could you mention each of these names again? Who they were?
My cantor was Morton Shanock, who was somewhere in Massachusetts, I believe. And my clerk, Milt Teicher, I think lives in the Bronx. I'm not sure, I haven't seen him. And Irving Rosenbusch lives in Miami. And so all of these men began to work with us in the project, helping us to collect the children, help bring them there, do what we can for the situation. However, I say within a week or two, we became aware that this was no solution. We had to find something bigger. Then we discovered, or rather Mr. Trachtenberg discovered, that there was an empty chateau at the edge of town, which I was informed once belonged to a Jew who was the coffee king of France. That's the picture of the chateau which I just showed you, and I'll be glad to give you a copy. And how would you get the chateau? So the first thing we did is Mr. Trachtenberg arranged for me to sponsor what we would call a tea party, but which they call something else in French, with the mayor of the town. And we had this little party with a sort of a wine party, you might call it such. And we worked out the following agreement, that I would pay or guarantee to the city, I think it was at least $500 a month for the use of this building, and we would be permitted to have the building. Now, this was a wonderful answer to the problem. However, what were we going to do for money? All right. This was right before Yontif, you see. I had already made arrangements to take over the Opera House in Le Mans for services for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And by chance, it happened to be that I was the only chaplain within hundreds of miles around. So we came up with this plan. That at services, I would explain this story to the GIs who came and ask them to turn over all the francs they had.
Which was not, you were not allowed to do that by the Army regulations.
Francs.
Well, they were.
Yeah, in other words, I wasn't giving them.
Solicit.
I don't know what the regulations are, frankly. But the $500 was to be paid in francs, you see. All right. So GIs came from all around. I had, I think, about 1,400 men to services. They came by the truckloads. And I can summarize the efforts of the 3 days by telling you.
Don't summarize.
The boys gave me $5,000 in francs. So I had enough to pay for the maintenance of the chateau for a long time to come. I had other problems of food and clothing, etc., which I'll come to later. So at least we knew. Of course, in the meantime, I had contacted, what's his name, who was Judah Nadich, who was with Eisenhower, in regard to JDC. Were they operating in France? He said, no, they were not operating, and we didn't know when they would come in. And it was many months later when they came in to operate. In other words, none of the charitable agencies were allowed into France at this particular time.
Right.
All right, so at least I knew I had a chateau. By that time, we had, as you can see from this picture, somewhere around 40 or 50 children. But we had enough money to take care of the cost of maintenance for 7 or 8 months to come. Now we also had problems of food. We had enough money to buy a certain amount of food, and then we tried to get the boys to help us with food. And then there are various ways which I remember. I can't remember them all, but I remember one chap, a Jewish officer, who ran a PX about 40 miles away. So I turned up one night to visit him, and he loaded me up with the main ingredients of barter were chocolates and cigarettes. This is the sort of thing, I say, that went on all the time. That we were still going out collecting children every day, you say.
Who's we?
The Milt Teicher, Irv Rosenbusch, Mort Shannock, and other fellows who were stationed at the time in the area and whom we called on for help.
The Army didn't bother you about that?
No. My chief chaplain, that is in other words, we operate under a section of a fellow named Brundick, Bill Brundick, who lives on, I think, Falls Church in Virginia somewhere. Had a fairly good idea of what I was doing.
It didn't bother you?
No, it didn't bother. I'll tell you a story about him later. And the proof of it is that he gave me top rating every month. You know, a chaplain in the section had to rate his subordinates, you see, and he gave me a top rating every month until much later.
How would you spell his name?
Brundick. William Brundick. He's an Episcopalian, I believe. I know while we were waiting in England, I tried to teach him some French without any success. Because you see, I spent about 5 weeks in England waiting to go over. So to come back to Le Mans, well, every day brought its problem, either going out to collect the child, finding money to pay for the child, doing something about clothes. Now, by the beginning of November, it got to be so cold, that these kids were practically in rags, you see. And I got a hold of Judah Nadich, who was in Paris by that time. I said, Judah, I've got to do something about getting clothes for these kids. Can you make arrangements to send me orders to go to London to get some clothing. And he said, Abe, I can't. There's a chaplains' conference in London, but it's supposed to be only for Jewish chaplains who are stationed in England. Well, finally, after considerable persuasion, he wangled orders for me to go to London.
I want to stop you here for a second, and I want to understand, if I possibly can, was the role of Rabbi Nadich in this. Was he helpful, or did you have to really persuade him to let you do this?
No, I don't think we had to persuade him. I think Judah was faced with the problem of how far could he bend regulations.
Well, I think that all of the chaplains had that problem.
Yeah, well, that's right.
There were people,
and that was an individual decision as to how far he could go.
Well, but
because this is the only experience I had with Judah.
Oh, okay. So, but you had to force him to do this?
Well, I mean, I pleaded strongly enough until he finally produced orders sending me to London, the excuse being that I was attending a chaplains' conference. But no one else was allowed to go. I'm sure many men would have liked to go. Anyway, I got to London, and through some of the chaplains in London, I contacted the Jewish community in London, and within 3 days I had gathered together a plane load of clothes.
Do you remember who you spoke to in London?
A bunch of women.
And which plane did you use to take it?
Army plane.
And they knew what was going on?
Sure.
How did that work out?
No, in other words, the orders, I had orders to fly out of Chartres. Well, there was an airplane base there.
Yeah.
There was an air base there.
To London?
And orders, yeah, I flew to London.
Now, this was not your private plane.
No, it was an army plane,
right.
of course.
So then how did you get a hold of a plane to fill it up?
No. I had orders to go back. And I was able to bring back as much as I...
Oh, you could take back as much as you wanted?
Yeah.
The Army didn't buy?
I don't know whether I had about 8 or 10 great big cartons full of clothing. In the meantime, Sam Rosen, who was an Air Corps chaplain stationed in England, had come over to visit his units. Sam's dead now. And when he came to my area to visit his Air Corps units, I took him over to see the chateau. And he said, Abe says, if you need anything, let me know when you get in London, you see. And of course, Sam was so taken aback by what he saw. He just stood there and cried like a baby. So I had no problem getting entree to people once in a while. Who the people were, I wasn't concerned with.
Right.
I had 4 or 5 days, and of course I officially attended the chaplains' conference.
Right. But you had, the chaplains in England were American chaplains who gave you entrance to...
Of course. Who had contacts with the London Jewish community. Okay. But I remember distinctly that all this was gathered for me by women. Then, of course, when I came back, I had clothes for these kids. In the meantime, one of the problems we face is what to do with their identity as Jews. Now, of course, these children, as you can see from the picture, ran at ages from 3 to 4 to 15, 16. So we decided one night we would strip them of all the medallions. I can't begin to describe to you the wailing that went on, particularly among the younger ones who thought that this was their only source of protection. So this was a constant enterprise until I received orders in December to leave, you see. And I had to move on to Rennes. So what I arranged was for the Ose to come in from Paris.
That's O-S-E.
O-S-E. Now, in the meantime, I think it was toward the end of October, or the middle of October, Meyer Levin had heard the story of this thing, and he came to visit.
Meyer Levin at that time was a JTA correspondent.
I don't know, he's a correspondent.
Yes, he was a JTA.
All right. He came with his girlfriend, Tereska, whatever her name is. He's married to her now. And spent a weekend there, and was quite impressed and wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post about it. And he also writes about it in his book, I'll show you. Well, anyway, talking over the problem with Meyer Levin, I asked him, could he help us get in touch with Père Devaux in Paris to smoothen this transition of getting these children. Fine. He agreed, and he went to Paris, And he arranged for a meeting between Père Devaux and me. And he describes it in his book, so I won't bother repeating it. And with no success. Because the answer Père Devaux gave me is this: how can I give you these children without the permission of their family? Knowing full well that very few families will not. So he describes the picture in his book as these two men fighting for the souls of children. Well, that really covers the highlight. Now, in town, outside of Mr. Trachtenberg, I only ran into one other Jewish family, a tailor by the name of Schneider, obviously a Polish Jew who had been in this town for many, many years and managed to hide during the occupation. And we visited him several times at his home. And then one day a man walks into my office, Frenchman, introduces himself to me, tells me he's a teacher in a town about 15, 20 miles away who had been connected with this, and he wanted me to come and have dinner with him. So my clerk and I went and spent a very pleasant evening with this man who had been in England during the First World War, telling us of, I don't remember what he told us, but I know he came because he felt committed to this thing somewhere. Because these children were scattered, I say, in a 30, 40-mile radius of Le Mans. Well, I think that about covers. I mean, there's no sense telling you the little things that the GIs would do to help us, because I can't remember all these details, except the one or two episodes that I mentioned to you.
You were the one that initiated this whole activity. In certain areas we find that the GIs may have come to the chaplain and said, "Chaplain, we have such and such a situation, we need your help."
No.
But in this case, you were the one who initiated it, and
right.
you enlisted the aid of your immediate
yes.
GIs who were either clerks or assistants or whatever, as well as
they were GI stationed there. There were others too involved. So I remember many years later, my mother telling me of a boy who worked with me then by the name of Brody, who worked in Macy's, because I remember the guy. So. You know what I mean? There are many others who helped.
And they heard about the situation and they wanted to, what are the type of things that the GIs may have done to help?
For example, they would, if they had access to chocolates and cigarettes, they would bring them to me. Because we use that to purchase food.
In other words, this was on the black market?
Yeah, that's right.
And
because these are two main commodities in the market.
Right. To
purchase anything, with cigarettes and chocolate.
Now, that could have...
there was one other Jewish girl I remember visiting in a farmhouse about 15, 20 miles away. That's all I remember.
Now, what you were doing was also illegal at this time, but you were doing...
Well, the question is, by what concept do you say illegal? For example, when I later on when I come to Marseille, I discovered that the Catholic chaplains did what they could charity-wise for the Catholic community. Mm-hmm. So in what sense can you use the term illegal? It may be officially.
Yeah, no, I'm not making any value judgment in terms of I'm just talking in terms of but the Army would say that their chaplain was taking chocolates and cigarettes and dealing with the black market in order to help Jewish children. They must have known that you were doing that.
I hate to tell you, Jewish chaplains who did it for themselves.
Well, that's another question which we should...
My two worst experiences were with two Orthodox rabbis.
The question is...
Look at the picture. I think around 40, between 40 and 50.
Because we're talking about now the question of how many children there were ultimately in this orphanage. Because Meyer Levin in his book, In Search...
This is it?
Yeah, on page 184, doing this for the record, it says 50 or 60 children are already gathered there.
Yeah. This is where I've covered the orphan asylum story.
Yeah.
Do you think I've given you...
Well, I would like to know, first of all, how did these children react to you? Well, after all, you had come in and had taken them out of homes.
Well, the reaction depended on the age of the child.
Okay.
Naturally, a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old child reacted different from a 12, 13, 14-year-old child.
Did they know they were Jews?
The younger they were, the less knowledge they had.
But did they know who they were? In other words, did they realized why they were in the special predicament that they were in?
Well, there again, I can only generalize on the basis of age.
Okay.
But for example,
right.
The night when we took all the medallions off,
right.
the wailing and the howling was on the part of the children, say, between the ages of 3 and 8 and 9. Mm-hmm. Not on the part of the children between 10 and 14.
They were willing to accept, to accept it being Jewish.
If this is a reflection of it, you say.
Well, but there was another manifestation.
Remember, this is also tied to the amount of time they were away.
Right. Okay. Well, that's what I'm trying to understand. How long?
I don't know how much time each child had been in this at this particular farm. You say.
Mm-hmm. But generally, what was the situation? They came willingly with you. They.
Oh yes. No, we had no problem with children objecting to going with us. No.
Well, what were they told? All of a sudden,
well, I had to leave these things to Monsieur Trachtenberg. So after all, my command of the French was not good enough, sufficient to be able to go into the details of the situation.
So he had prepared the situation.
In other words, it seems to me, from my recollection, that he presumed to speak on behalf of the American army, so to speak. I think this was his cover that he used. To make it easier. Of course. No, but you see, my presence with my rank, my car, my driver, and so on and so forth, this gives an atmosphere of officiality to his requests, you see. But I remember the number of requests which were refused, in other words. This is what led to the meeting with the Père de Vaux, you see. Mm-hmm. So it didn't always work, you see.
So where it worked,
Where it worked, we got children for nothing. Where it didn't work, sometimes we had to pay and get them. And some who just refused until they had permission or word from the priest.
Now, what was the outcome again of this meeting that you had with?
Well, you'll find it in the book.
Okay, fine. All right. And then, what finally happened to this orphanage and the children?
Well, as I say, I had received word that I was going to be moved, which was happening always at the army. And immediately, I got into contact with Yarbloom to find out whether he's going to take over. Right. Nothing doing. So I began to cast around for...
Why didn't he want to do that? I mean, I would assume that this would be a very important...
This was my desire too, as a way station on the way to Israel after the war ended, you see, is what I envisioned this place to be, you see.
Have you ever spoken to Yarbloom about that since?
No, I had no occasion to speak.
It's Jarbloom.
He's dead. He died about 2 years ago. Yeah. 3 years ago. He settled here finally. So that was the end of that matter. Fortunately, through contacts in Paris, I think it was through Judah Nage's office, I'm not sure, I located this OSE organization. Well, they heard about it and came to see me. I don't remember which it was. Anyway, 2 gentlemen came to see me, and we agreed to transfer to them as soon as I had to leave, which we did at the beginning of December, when I had to move on to Rennes.
December 1944.
That's right.
Okay. So the period of time we're talking about was from what?
And I was in Le Mans roughly from September 18th to... September, yeah, about September 18th. 18th, 25th, something like that. December. Until the beginning of December.
And having completed your work, you then had to go on.
Yeah. Now, what I did arrange was I arranged to see that my cantor stayed there and wasn't transferred out. Because this is the time of the Battle of the Bulge, if you remember.
Right.
When they were always looking for men they needed for the front lines, you see. So I had to take a choice between either my clerk or the cantor to stay on, to carry on, you see. So that's the reason I've lost contact with the clerk. He was really very unhappy about my choice of the cantor, who I felt could contribute more, you see, to the situation.
Now, so this cantor was not you weren't a team. He just happened to be in the army. He just happened to
be stationed in the area. His job was filling gas tanks, gas cans. He was at a gas can station. But I felt that he would be more apt to carry on effectively this job, of helping the orphan asylum.
Okay, was there any other aspect of the or the entire operation that should be mentioned?
Nothing that I can think of. Nothing that stands out in my mind.
Okay, now...
and then we move on to Germany.
Okay, fine.
Right. Now, if you recall, I left Le Mans and spent a few weeks in Rennes, R-E-N-N-E-S, and from there I was transferred over to Dijon to take Maurice Kurtz's place with the 7th Army ADSEC, which had come up from the invasion of Toulon, up along the Rhone River,
that's
up to Dijon. R-H-O-N-E, yes. And they were now headquartered in Dijon. And Kurtz received an opportunity to go back to Marseille with what is going to be set up there as a base section. So I was transferred to Dijon to take his place with 7th Army ADSEC. 2 weeks after I arrived in Dijon, or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, we moved on to Nancy.
Nancy, France.
Getting ready to go into Germany. See? And we stayed in Nancy for about 4 or 5 weeks during Passover, when I conducted a big Seder at the big synagogue in Nancy. Which I think again, I had something like 1,500 GIs there.
There were no DPs?
No DPs. There were some, wait a second, there were some Jews in the local community by that time.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm asking you about that.
I think you'll find them. I have another picture. There were 1 or 2 Jews in the community who worked with me, but their names I don't remember, because I was only in Nancy for a few weeks.
This was Pesach 1945?
1945, that's right. Now, I want to dig out the picture of this guy.
Well, the main point I'm interested is what took place in terms of the Jewish
in other words,
DPs.
the reason I contacted the few Jews that remained in the Nancy community is because I wanted to use the synagogue, this big synagogue, for a Seder. So I had to contact people in the community. They were opposed to my using the synagogue for Seder. I pointed out to them with the number of GIs I'd have to have a place big enough for them.
Why were they opposed to it?
They're not accustomed to a Seder in the synagogue, proper. It wasn't a hall. See, what we did is the Germans had taken over this synagogue and used it for a warehouse. So all the appurtenances had been removed, the chairs and everything.
Yeah, but the Aron Kodesh looks intact.
Yeah, that's right. Because remember, this is some weeks after Nancy had been liberated sometime before that.
I understand, but they didn't destroy it.
No, they didn't. But I had a picture of this with all the Nazi storehouses, supplies in here too, somewhere. So it was easy for me to try to get tables and chairs and convert the whole place into a place for a Seder. Because I had to use every available space. There were balconies, I had chairs and tables all over the place.
Yeah, I see that was the Mechitza.
Roughly about 1,400, 1,500 chairs. Yeah, there were the balconies, there's the Mashim. And I set up tables and chairs there. So a couple of days after that, we were on the move. And of course, the GIs who came, many of them were from divisions that were getting ready for the move into Germany. That's the reason I had so many. I think it was the 34th Division was waiting to move into Germany. And then I don't know whether it was the 6th or the 7th of April that we made that breakthrough at Remagen.
How do you spell that?
R-E-M-A-G-E-N. When they were able to put a bridge across the Rhine.
Right.
And start moving, fanning out, you see. So on the 9th, we were on our way to Germany.
It's April 9th.
April 9th. It took us a couple of days to get there, and we settled, as I say, in this little town outside of Mannheim called Seckenheim. And I cast about for a place for services. I decided to use the planetarium, one of the few buildings that was standing in Mannheim. Because Mannheim is a very interesting town historically. It's the town from which the Morgenthau family came, as well as a number of other famous personalities. The Benno Jacobs, the famous Orthodox rabbi 50, 60 years ago, Rabbi Mannheim. So it's a community with great interest. And 2 days later, I had set up services at the planetarium. And when I get there to conduct my first service, here's this woman with someone else. There's Mrs. Schauder in San Diego that I'm talking about.
And then how do you spell that name?
S-C-H-A-U-D-E-R. She had 2 boys, and she had she had 1 son with her, but she had another son whom she had hidden away somewhere. I'll come to that later. And through her, I met a few other Jews, and I met the Jew in the community who was the liaison with the Nazis, a half-Jew. I think his name is Hauser. Through him, I got a list of all the Jews that remained in Mannheim. And the only Jews that remained were half-Jews. That is what they call Mischling, or Mischling. Now, she survived. This Mrs. Schauder survived because she was not a German Jew, she was a Romanian Jew. Her husband had a business in Worms, and the relations between Romania and Germany was such that she was able to survive until she had to go into hiding. She went to hiding with her two boys. Finally, she managed to find a farmer in southern Germany who hid her one son in a barn. Some weeks later, I took her down there. She had no idea whether the son was still alive, and we found this boy. That's her younger son. So little by little, I began to discover that there were a number of Jewish young people in Heidelberg and in Mannheim who had come into Germany as part of the labor force that was brought in from Ausland. They posed as Poles. And in every case, Poles or Czechs, they were people who had a good command of Polish language. Otherwise, they couldn't have gotten by with this, you see. And of course, they wore crosses or crucifixes. They had to do something in order to be taken into Germany. And I gathered together, I think eventually I got to know about 20 such young people. And one of them, I was living with this girl because he couldn't get married in Germany. And she was pregnant 6 months and they wanted to be married. That's the only wedding I performed in Germany. They live in, he's a printer in Brooklyn, Sigmund Halperin, you remember? Sigmund Halperin. Now, the synagogue in Mannheim had been completely vernichtet, so to speak. There were all the ruins. So I did find some Nazi flags in there, I remember. I brought back, Arthur got one, and a helmet. So I began to cast them out as I took the planetarium, but the planetarium turned to be unsatisfactory. So I hopped down to Heidelberg. Heidelberg had been untouched, you see. And I found in Heidelberg the synagogue had been destroyed to the ground, but next to it was the Shamas's home. And I converted that into a chapel. And this is where I met most of the young people.
They came to you?
Yeah. Most of them were Poles, some of them were Czechs. But now, if you have an opportunity in New York to get a hold of Sigmund Halperin, he'll be able to fill you in more on details. He's a printer in Brooklyn. He works in New York. And take a chance. I'm pretty sure.
I'm not going back to New York.
Oh, well, whenever you go back. Oh, you're going to finish the thesis here?
Yeah.
Can you get a hold of a New York telephone book, a Brooklyn telephone book?
Well, I'll have somebody do that for me.
But it's Sigmund and Mary Halperin. And they live in an odd part of Brooklyn. Oh, we may have the address. What is that?
Okay, fine. While she's looking for it, let's go on.
So the first few weeks I was busy setting up and getting oriented in the neighborhood, etc. And about 3 weeks after I arrived, I get this telephone call that there are a group of Jews, formerly from a concentration camp, who are in the French zone, in such and such a place called Neunkirchen, which is near a town called Bruchsal. Neunkirchen is spelled Neuenkirchen. And the nearest big town is Bruchsal, Bruchsal. So, of course, I immediately got a hold of my clerk in my car, my Jeep, and we drove down there. We drove down to this little town, which is a village probably with a couple of hundred families, and all the families had been ejected, and these men were scattered throughout these houses. Quite a number of them were sick and dying of typhus. And it's my judgment that they were left behind by the Nazis in the hope that they would infect the advancing Allied armies with typhus. Because most of the men were bedridden when I came, or they were laying in bed, you see. And as soon as they heard that I was a rabbi, a chaplain, so on and so forth, we immediately arranged to bring all those who could on their feet to a little hall in this little village. And of the 200, I think about 100 managed to get on their feet into this hall. And I immediately began to become aware that these were men who had gone through a long tragic experience. And it became apparent from my conversation with them that they were the remnant of some 10,000 Jews who had been gathered together in Radom, Poland.
R-A-N-D-O-M.
R-A-D-O-M.
R-A-D-O-M.
I've met the group here, also in Los Angeles. I'll tell you about that later. And to my knowledge, I was the first Jewish chaplain they met. So we sat around in that hall, deciding how to communicate. And the only language of communication was Yiddish. So for the first time in my life, I got up and I think I spoke for almost 4 hours, trying to tell them they had been moving about from place to place for about 1.5 years now, of what had happened in Jewish life during that 1.5 years. So that begins the second episode. And of course that became involved with what are we going to do, how to proceed, what to operate. My first contact was Al Hutler, who was the DP officer in our area. And the first couple of weeks I began to bring them all kinds of supplies, things that they could use, whether food or cigarettes or candy or chocolate. And one day I brought them a couple of women even, Jewish women, from a barracks some miles away from Mannheim, where I discovered there were a group of Jewish women who had also survived concentration camp. And it's the first time these men had seen a Jewish woman in almost 2 years. So you can imagine, this is the kind of thing that went on from day after day. In the meantime, Al Hutler and I were discussing what are we going to do about these men. And then we came up with this plan to bring them out of the French zone, which after all, the French kept them there and provided them a certain amount of medical attention, that's about all. So we found a series of barracks in Bensheim, and Al arranged for enough trucks. We went down there, loaded them in the trucks out of these, of course I don't mind saying, they took everything they could find out of these houses where they were stationed, you see. And we loaded them in trucks and took them up to Bensheim and settled them in these barracks with the understanding that this would be a temporary thing until we find a more permanent solution.
Didn't you have to clear this with the Army?
He was the DP officer.
He was the DP, so he could do anything. What was his rank, do you remember?
He was a captain, I think.
A captain.
Or a major, I'm not sure. He'll tell you that. He was at least a captain, I know that. Because Al Hutler will tell you, he used to be the assistant director of the Jewish Federation in Chicago. From there he went out to San Diego to become the director of the Federation. He was here a few months ago giving lectures for the Jewish Agency. But you must get in touch with him. All right, so we decided after a few weeks to bring them to Bensheim. We brought them to Bensheim, and these were just ordinary barracks, you see. We realized that was not the solution. So in the meantime, as he scattered around, surveying the area in which we found ourselves, he discovered this beautiful castle back in the Heidelberg Mountains, about 10 miles up the Neckar River in the Heidelberg Mountains. And he had the authority to commandeer the place. And again, we loaded them in trucks. We took them to this Schloss. Schloss is the German equivalent of castle. And of course, these men were pleased beyond words. I'll never forget the first Saturday night after they were in the castle. Despite all that they had been through, they arranged for a cultural evening. Yiddish, music, whatever they could. A cultural evening, which to me was an amazing performance. When you think what these men had been through, that they had enough in them to Of course, in the meantime, they developed some kind of leadership among themselves, which, of course, I didn't want to get involved in, although I met some of them later. So it was a regular thing for me to come there. Now, of course, once these men were settled on the Schloss, then began all kinds of activities and help which they needed in search of relatives.
When was this Schloss?
They moved into the Schloss. I came into Germany, I say it was April 9th, April 10th, April 11th. I think I moved them into the Schloss in either the middle of May. The middle of May, because the war ended, I think, on May 12th.
Well, May 5th, May 8th.
Something like that. But it was sometime in the middle of May we moved them into the Schloss.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, it was a day-by-day operation, what we could do to help them. Mm-hmm. The needs were provided for by the army, as far as food and that sort of thing. Besides, they could always take from the Germans if necessary. So. But once the war ended, then began the shifting around of army personnel. So by the middle of June, I knew I was leaving. So these men were well settled. They had all, every day somebody would go out in search of contacts. They would go to Munich, to Klausner's outfits. In other words, in every one of these outfits there were names and addresses, which were moved around, you see. Like, for example, when I got the list of names and addresses of the Jews of Mannheim who were sent to a concentration camp in France, Gurs.
Right. G-U-R-S.
That's right. All right. I sent that whole list to Judanevich. What he did with it, I don't know. But by the way, while I was in Mannheim, I told you I met a number of youngsters who had come into Poland as laborers, you see.
Right.
And I also met two boys who had come to town also to work, who had been in, which camp did they burn down? Not Treblinka. They had been in the insurrection in Treblinka, two Jewish boys from Czechoslovakia. And we set them up in an apartment. And one day a boy walks into my office, who was born and raised in Mannheim. He had just come out of Buchenwald a few weeks before, looking for his family. This boy is now the second top man in UJA. He's the executive director of UJA in New York.
What's his name?
Ernest Michel. I want you to see him.
Ernest Michel.
Michel. Because we've been in close touch ever since. E-R-N-E-S-T, M-I-C-H-E-L. And of course, I set him up with these two boys from Czechoslovakia in an apartment. And then I did what I could do, try to get him some kind of visa to come to the United States and so on and so forth. But then you can remember, this is all while I was getting ready to move on. So I left all these people in the camp, in the Schloss, and these people in the town. Incidentally, I'll tell you a very interesting story about that. About 10 years ago, we were preparing to go out one evening in California where we lived, and somebody knocks at the door. And Rabbi Haselkorn, I said, yes, may I come in? And he introduces him. My name is Green. You don't remember me, but I was in a Polish camp in the French zone, and I was in a French hospital when you came down to take our men out. You see, and I knew that if you took our men out, you see, and I had to go back to a Polish camp, my life wasn't worth 2 cents. I sent word to you. And you made a special trip down to take me out of the hospital, bring me up to join the other men. Okay. And then about 7 years ago, I get a letter from some woman in Los Angeles whose husband was in this group. And she had been looking for me for 20 years. Turned out she was a Hebrew teacher, and she was working in a reform camp in Saratoga and someone told her that I was rabbi nearby. So she insisted that they had a group of people from Radom, from this camp, this group, who had kind of settled in the United States, and she arranged a sort of a meeting and a party in my honor at one of the big synagogues, and of course the usual spiel. I stay away from these things. I don't. And then 10 years ago, when we were here 10 years ago, I discovered that there was a Radom society here, and they also arranged a big party for me at one of the halls here in Tel Aviv. And of course, every one of the men came up to me, do I remember him here, and so on. Of course, it's impossible to do that. Some of the faces I remembered, but some of them I didn't. So there's a group here of Radom. I have their memorial book, by the way, too. And there's a group in Los Angeles. Since we're living here, I haven't tried to contact them. So I find myself very uncomfortable with these people because they're always saying thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, you saved their lives. Was there anything else about this DP camp, this castle that you wanted to talk about? The role of the GIs involved in this?
Well, actually,
this again was on your initiative, with the help of an American Jewish GI.
Well, actually, most of the advice and counsel and effort was with Al Hutler.
That's H-U-T-T-L-E-R.
I'll give you
one T.
Yeah, one.
Oh, H-U-T-L-E-R. Okay.
I'll give you that information.
Okay.
Because what happened to my clerk, then I don't remember. He went home, and I was left pretty much alone. But I didn't bother too much because I was on my way, getting ready to leave.
Right. Now
so I can't give you any context, so to speak, except Al Hutler and Ernie Michel.
Right.
So
okay.
These two will give you the. And I'll give you the name of this Mrs. Schwartz in Los Angeles.
Okay. Alex Schwartz.
Alex Schwartz.
Alice? No.
Alex. A-L-E-X.
Oh, Alex, that's right. His name was Schwartz something, he shortened it.
Okay.
Well, you want to stop that till we decide where we go from there?
Well, next, where did you go? Where did you go actually from there?
I received orders to go back to Marseille.
Okay.
And I turned up in Marseille on the 4th of July, I think, in 1945. Now, but I wasn't stationed in Marseille because Maurice Kurtzer was in Marseille. So I was sent out to Aix-en-Provence, the famous home of Darius Milhaud, where he was born and raised. And I was assigned to the staging area for the men on their way to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
I covered that for 2 weeks until Maurice Kurtzer left. Then I took his place
in
Marseille. And I also had to be responsible for the staging area. So the day after I arrived in Marseille, moving from Aix to a man drops in my office, introduced himself as Shimon.
No last name.
No last name. All these were names taken on. And he begins to tell me something of their work and would I help him? Of course, I was delighted to help. So.
Now, I'd like to stop you with that because it wasn't, from what I understand, normal procedure for someone from the Palestinian group to right away come in and talk to a rabbi. They were, from what I understood, to be very leery of chaplains.
Yeah.
And that you had to show something that you were interested. I mean, how did they just approach you this way?
Frankly,
right?
That's the only recollection I have. And of course, when he sat in my office and talked, because I had told him of my activities in the Zionist movement in the States. I was president of the Empire State Zionist region before I went to the army. So I had a background of activity in the Zionist movement. I don't recall any discussion with him of that, though. I don't recall any probing of me by him, except that he had met Kurtzer some time before. Now, of course, remember, he hadn't been there very long. This was only 2 months after the war ended.
Okay, fine. I think we can talk to him about that aspect.
Yeah, that's right.
So you had this meeting with Shimon, whose real name is?
At the moment, Isaac Levy.
Isaac Levy, okay.
And then, within the next couple of days, I met a partner of his who was introduced to me as Fernand. Fernand is Hanan Geismar, who is one of the administrative heads of Zim today in Haifa. Just had dinner with him a few weeks ago. Right. Then later on, another man appeared some weeks later, who was introduced to me as Willie, and that happens to be his real name, Willie Katz, who was a chaver in Kibbutz Usha. And all of these men have very interesting backgrounds. For example, Shimon had escaped from Israel because he was wanted by the police for a raid on an arms cache. The other two had been active, but not in an anti-government way as Shimon was. And then began the day-by-day operations, I call it. In other words, he would come by to see me, whether it was every day or every other day, and what's the problem, what can we do to help, and we would help. You see.
What were the type of problems that you were dealing with?
Well, it happens, I forgot to tell you one important thing.
Okay.
Soon after I appeared, I discovered a young man, an American boy who'd been living in Israel with his family, Cy Kaller.
C-A-L-L.
S-I.
S-I.
Shimon.
Right.
Kaller, C-A-L-L-E-R.
Right.
I hope you'll meet him. And he had gone to Israel to visit his family and decided to stay there, that's all. He was a member of the Kibbutz Kfar Giladi at the time. And he also knew Shimon. He had been in Marseille for some time. He had enlisted in the American army in Alexandria from Egypt and moved westward, so to speak. And as soon as I established contact with him, I arranged to have him become a clerk of mine. In the meantime, there also appeared Henry Wimpheimer, whom I had met before. When I was in Le Mans, he was with the 94th Division that came over the channel and had a terrible accident. One ship went down, hundreds of men were. And I used to go every week to service the 94th Division. They were stationed, a stationary position around the ports of Saint-Nazaire-l'Orient, where there was a division of Germans, the submarine pens. And since they had no Jewish chaplain, Henry Wimpheimer acted as the Jewish chaplain. And then, when I get to Marseille, I discover Henry has been transferred to Marseille. So I immediately took him on as my clerk. And by a little finagling, I managed to keep two clerks. Technically, I was only entitled to one assistant, you see. But we managed two of them, see. And then we began to spread out our enterprise. Henry was primarily interested in Jewish refugees in France. For example, we discovered there was an orphan asylum in Lyon. So Henry and I began to gather food and clothing, and Henry took a truck, which we got from the post, and drove up to Lyon and brought the food and clothing to the orphan asylum Lyon.
How often would you do this?
Well, remember, I was only there for 6 months.
6 months, right.
And of course, it takes time before all these things unfold. Mm-hmm. But the day-by-day operation was with the shlichim and their problems and their concerns. For example, one of the things we did is they needed some form of communication with Tel Aviv. Right? Sai, through our signal division, managed to get, of course there was a number of Jewish boys in signal, okay, enough equipment for us to have set up an illegal radio station at Toulon, by which we were in communication with Tel Aviv.
Has this ever been told?
I don't know. Sai will tell you about it.
Well, let me hear your side of it.
So we used to get messages from Tel Aviv through Toulon, and these messages would be brought by the shaliach to my office, and we would call the top man in Paris on the military wire, this fellow Shaul Avigur, who was the head of the whole operation in Europe, working out of Paris. I'll fill in the names later.
Well, it's best if we have everything.
Yeah, all right. So we did this for about 6 or 7 weeks, until one day the telephone operator happened to listen in to the conversation in Hebrew. So that was the end of that operation.
Well, what did they do to you?
Nothing, though. Sorry to inform you that only English may be spoken on the military wire.
Oh, and that was it. But they didn't realize it was an illegal activity.
No.
So for
I was one who answered.
So for 6 weeks.
6 or 7 weeks.
6 or 7 weeks, you were able to transmit illegal information to Tel Aviv.
Well, I say information messages that were being sent from Tel Aviv to the operations in Europe.
Right.
So, this fellow Shalom Victor is still alive, I think.
Yeah.
He happens to be a brother of Moshe Sharet's sister. These things are all tied up. And then, shortly thereafter, I was informed that they're also collecting arms and ammunition. In order to cover this contingency, they had already set up, by the time I got there, 2 hachsharot. A third was set up later near Biarritz. That's how I came to get Rakovsky. We had 1 hachshara Yamit down by the bay, Marseille, and we had 1 hachshara up in the hills in the background. So what they did is they arranged to build a secret hiding room in the one up in the hills where we kept the guns.
What was that name again? The one up in the hills?
I don't remember the name. It's in a suburb of Marseille up in the hills. Because you see, behind Marseille, there are hills going back.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, we were providing whatever we could for the kids who were in the hachsharot. Now, who were in these hachsharot? Then later on, we had another one, near Toulouse. This is how I got to Biarritz. And we would periodically travel to these places to give these kids candy, cigarettes, supplies that we would gather together. Now, by this time, we had word from Tel Aviv that they were under orders to prepare for the first shipload of illegals from Western Europe in terms of a boat with about 600 people that might have to be on the water for a month. And we were under instructions to prepare all the necessities for that.
We meaning the
Mossad.
The Mossad.
That's all. I was just an instrument of theirs. So we began collecting food. Now, Marseille happened to be the great storehouse for the American Army, which my clerk Sy discovered, you see. So what I did, I'd send him out 3 times a week with a half-ton truck to get whatever he could get, and you could get plenty. You see. Now I wanted to cover what?
How?
All kinds of food.
But
Just
I mean,
to go in.
Just go in
Just go in.
The chaplain needed it?
That's right. Now let me give you the cover. I talked to the Catholic chaplain, who was my boss, Pat Fay, a wonderful guy.
Oh, yes, I know.
I said, Pat, did Morris Kurtz tell him about him?
Yes.
Yeah. I said, Pat, you need something for the Catholic poor in town. Why don't Sy go out and get food and you and I split it between us, you see? Wonderfully. So Sy went out 3 times a week with a half-ton truck, which we loaded up with food. But Pat didn't know that on the way back, Sy stopped at the Hachshara and unloaded half. Then came back to my office and we split.
It reminds me of Shnaim Achazim Betalit in the Gemara.
So this kind of, now one day the boys in the brigade came down. They had problems with their vehicles, so on and so forth. So again, I contacted transportation and was able to take care of them. Oh, one day, for example, we had an apartment. Gary Bernstein and I and a cousin of his had an apartment in Marseille. 1 o'clock in the morning, somebody knocks at our apartment. In walks an officer from the Russian army. There was a Russian camp nearby of Russian laborers who had been brought to France by the Nazis to work, you see. And this guy was a Russian officer partly in charge of this camp. And he came to knock at our door because he wanted help to get to Israel. So, of course, we sat for hours while he told us his background experiences. And, of course, we couldn't do anything directly, but we put him in touch with the brigade. You see. Mm-hmm. This is the kind of experience we had. Or About 4 weeks after I arrived there, Eisenhower gave us a Liberty ship to take a group of certificated Jews to Israel.
A group of
Jews with certificates.
certificates. Yeah.
This ship was docked at Toulon.
At
Toulon.
Toulon.
T-O-U-L-O-N.
Yeah.
And among the group that had certificates was the Buchenwald group, who settled Lochmauter ghetto up near.
Right. This
in Germany, it was called Kibbutz Buchenwald.
this was the group that Marcus was involved with. Or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's right. All right, so we need help. So we all pile in, go over to Toulon, as Jews with certificates are loading on. Because there was a place near Marseille where these people with certificates were kept waiting for this boat to come. See? And we cooked up a little deal. See? Every person received a permit to go on board with a certificate. We gave them instructions that when you get on board, go to the end of the ship. We'll be down below on the dock. Throw down the pass to us. We got about 150 to 200 extra people on board. Or one night.
And now, let me just stop for a second. What was your role in all of this? Were you involved in this actually?
I was involved in terms of assisting.
Yeah, right. But I want to be specific.
But the immediate task, for example, Sai handled that.
Right. Okay.
This fellow Sai, he'll fill you in many more details than I can possibly remember. So.
Okay.
Oh, one night Shimon comes to me. I don't know, it's late in the evening, 8, 9 o'clock. They have a problem. They bought a shipload of arms from the communists. They bought a load of arms. How can they get them to the Akshara? The French police are on the highways. If they do it as civilians, they'll get caught. Would I do it for them? So Sai, who at that time was an Israeli, said, "No, Rabbi, don't." Well, anyway, they twisted my arm because I had a car, I had an Opel. Or rather, Gary Bernstein had an Opel which I could use. So what we did, we took the Opel, we drove out to this place and filled the trunk with the weapons and brought it up to Akshara. We put it in the secret rooms.
But there wasn't that much that you could fill up a
No,
trunk.
of course not. But the communists had quite an ample supply of arms in France. Or, for example, one night